Well, all right. Hi, and welcome back. We are now moving into chapter three, which is about perception or sensation of perception, however you want to call it. Um, this is sort of our first step into the various cognitive processes. So, as noted in I guess in the first chapter, cognitive psych is the study of cognitive processing, right? And so perception, attention, memory, reasoning, decision making, these will make up the real bulk of the course. We've covered some of the broader theoretical kind of overarching frameworks like the information processing and computational views. And we've covered a little bit of the neuroscience. Now we're going to get into the actual details of the processes themselves, beginning with perception. See if we can make this slideshow work. There we go. So what we're going to do, what we're going to start with for this topic is we're going to look at what we might call problems, right? Uh, so what does it mean to say problems in perception? Well, this is a difficult thing to explain, as it turns out. It might seem not obvious, right? We perceive the world around us without any particular effort, right? We can just look out and we can see the room that we are in. We recognize objects. We can tell how far away things are. We can determine what color they are. We can hear things and we recognize the kind of event that is making the sound, and we can tell when it's quiet or loud. We can hear music and recognize melodies. All of this stuff we do with minimal effort and a high degree of accuracy. One other example, by the way, is to think of our sense of touch, right? So uh, we can take an object, hold it in our hands, and recognize it even with our eyes closed in many cases, right? We wrap our hands around something, we can tell its shape, its size, material composition, and like I said, even what it is. But despite the fact that people are just so ordinarily good at regular everyday perception, we don't necessarily have a good understanding of how this even works. So one of the most mundane aspects of human behavior, mundane being it's just something we do every single day, um, has some of the hardest kind of theoretical challenges to face to explain it. So forget about all of the higher level cognitive and other kinds of more abstract topics in psychology. Perception itself is a challenging kind of fundamental starting point. So I have listed here 5 problems that perceptual scientists, or perceptionists, as we like to be called sometimes, um, I say we because I am one, is that these 5 problems here are the ones that we need to try to find answers to. So the first question is, what is the stimulus? This seems to be kind of obvious in some respects, right? That there's an object, maybe to be perceived. I can lift up my coffee mug here and say, okay, well, this is a stimulus in the sense that I'm going to perceive and recognize it and use it to drink my coffee and so forth. But we need to think about this from a slightly different perspective, because sometimes when we think about, what am I perceiving when I perceive something? Well, we usually think we're perceiving the physical world around us. But there is an issue here that if we were to ask a physicist to describe the physical world around us, they might start to talk about atoms and gravitational fields and space-time and things of this nature. And we might say, well, sure, but that's that's we don't perceive that because atoms are too small and subatomic particles are too small. So we perceive objects. And yes, of course, that's the case. But the relationship between atoms and objects, condensed matter physics, these are things that we don't really want to try to struggle with in a psychology course. But it's kind of getting at the heart of the question here a little bit, which is what's the difference between an object and all of the atoms that make it up? But maybe a slightly better, easier way to approach this is to think about vision, because when I am looking at an object such as my coffee mug, light is reflecting off of that, and that light consists of electromagnetic energy, right? The actual visible spectrum of light. And so we can say, is that the stimulus? And that is difficult, right? Because if light was the stimulus, we don't actually technically see light. And that's a weird thing to say because what we do is we see the object, we don't see the light bouncing off of it, and yet light is the thing that carries the information to our eyes. So distinguishing light as a physical thing that's out there in the world, which it is technically, right? Versus something that we don't really perceive it directly, but rather we use it as information, right? That makes light as kind of a stimulus. We sometimes talk about light being a stimulus because the light rays come into our eyeballs and strike cells on the retina. So in that sense, it's a stimulus because it's stimulating the photoreceptors in the eye. But at the same time, it's not a stimulus because we are not really consciously aware of or are perceiving the light rays themselves. We're perceiving objects. So this is where the problem is, if you can sort of see where I'm going here, is understanding the difference between the distal object, the things in the world, versus the more proximal stimulation, the light rays and the sound waves and all the other stuff that are in direct contact with these sensory surfaces of our body. That becomes, something we need to worry about. So that's a problem that we need to try to address and understand. Now, speaking of this idea that sensory energy is coming in and coming into contact with our sensory surfaces, that what I mean is that we have sensory neurons, right? We have the photoreceptors, rods and cones in the retina of the eye. We have the hair cells, the sound wave detectors in the inner ear. We have mechanical receptors in the skin that respond to touch. We have chemical receptors in the taste buds and in the nasal olfactory epithelium for taste and smell. So there are different forms of stimulus energy that are going to activate these different kinds of sensory neurons. And that's a process that needs to be understood as well, right? How is it that these sensory neurons are responding to that energy? And how do they encode it into a nerve signal? And how does that encoding of that nerve signal then provide a pattern of activation that's going to then be sent to the brain, right? So that's steps 3 and 4 here, right? There's some kind of pattern that gets encoded from all of these many sensory neurons that are stimulated. What is that pattern? And then that pattern, if we want to think of it again as a code, is then transmitted to the brain. And we might think that the brain's job is to decode this pattern to understand what it is that we are looking at. Let me try to frame this another way. Let's say, for example, that I write a message in actual code, right? Like I have some sort of an algorithm that converts one letter into another letter. And there's a simple rule that I'm following to convert one letter to another. And so I can write a coded message. And so the stimulus is the true message that I'm sending. But when that gets encoded into my secret code, then I have converted it into a new pattern, right? And now that pattern has an encoded message, and I have to then give it to a person. And then that person's going to look at this and they're going to say, it's just a bunch of letters to me. I don't recognize this. It doesn't look like a message. But then if they happen to know some rules, and what are these rules? These rules are basically some information they might have about how that message was encoded in the first place. Then they might be able to decode the message and understand what it was that I'm trying to say to them secretly. And that's kind of what we're describing here, right? Is that we have an object and that object reflects light, and this light activates a bunch of individual photoreceptors in our eyes, and that information is then encoded into a nerve signal that creates a pattern. And this pattern of nerve activation is not one-to-one equal to the object in any direct way. And so it becomes an encoded message that gets sent into the brain, where now we think the job of the brain is to decode that pattern to figure out what in the world am I looking at? And I kind of mean that phrase, what in the world, in two ways, right? There's the kind of the mild expletive way, what in the world is that? But there's also is much more of a literal statement. What out there in the world is that I'm looking at? What I have been given is a message from my eyes telling me that there's this encoded message, and I have to decode it to figure out what's going on out there in the world. right? So take that phrase, what in the world, both ways here. And then, of course, one thing that might not seem always obvious from a perceptual perspective, but we perceive the world for a reason. And that means that we need to think about the functional role of perception. What are we perceiving for? Obviously, we want to recognize things, but most of our everyday lives don't necessarily involve going around naming things, right? That's not standard perception, is to walk around saying, that's a car, and that's a tree, and that's a building, and that's a coffee mug, right? Rather, we just physically interact with the world because we have accurate spatial perception. And so I can walk around in a cluttered environment and not trip over things. I can walk through a doorway without crashing into the side, usually. Uh, um, what else? I can pick up the coffee mug and drink from it, right? And even if I don't know the name of it as coffee mug, I still know that I can put my hand around it, right? So there's this issue of action as well as recognition, and we may need to tackle some of that as well. Let's start though with problem number one, and let's get into a little bit more detail. The stimulus, right? So as I've already described, we think of for vision, we think of the visible spectrum of light, which is a narrow band of electromagnetic radiation. And that's going to be the stimulus for vision in the sense that it stimulates the receptors, right? But again, that's not what we see. Likewise, um, with a sound producing event, so I'll knock on my desk here. What happens is that I have created um, a vibration, right? The desk is vibrating, but also the air molecules between my hand and the desk, or even when I clap, the air molecules between my hands is compressed. So that creates a high pressure area in the air, right? The actual air molecules are compressed together. This makes it a high pressure area. And when we have a continuous tone, like if I were playing a musical instrument or even striking a tuning fork, we would get a continuous vibration. And that's going to cause an alternating pattern of high and low pressure that travels through the air. We want to think of this as a wave. So just like you might watch a wave travel across the surface of water, we would have a similar kind of thing happening with a pressure wave traveling through the air. And so that pressure wave is going to enter into your ear, and it's going to cause different moving parts, the eardrum, the three bones, hammer, anvil, stirrup, to vibrate. And eventually this vibratory pattern then is transmitted into the cochlea of the inner ear, where we have these little hair cells and little membranes inside the inner ear are going to start vibrating. And they pull and push and pull on the cilia of these hair cells, and that triggers an action potential. So that then becomes the stimulus, these pressure waves. I mentioned touch earlier, so we have mechanoreceptors in our skin. They respond to pressure. So direct contact is a pressure stimulus, and that direct pressure on these receptors in the skin will stimulate an action potential. They also respond to stretching, though, because when we move our bodies, the skin stretches, or even if I have a really high amount of pressure, deep pressure on the skin, that also stretches the skin a little bit so they can respond to pressure and stretching and bending. We have similar receptors that are actually embedded in the muscles and tendons, and that also provides information about our bodies, right? So that's proprioception is our body posture, and kinesthesis is our body movement. So again, now this kind of mechanical pressure and vibration and stretching of the skin surface and or deformation of other body tissues like muscles and tendons, that then also becomes a physical stimulus for, in this case, we might call it all haptics, if you want to call it that. There's also our sense of the vestibular system. We sometimes usually think of this as your sense of balance, the vestibular system. But I think better, the vestibular system should be thought of as an accelerometer. What's happening is that it detects both linear and rotational accelerations, primarily of the head, since these organs are in our inner ear within the head. But obviously, sometimes when our bodies move and our heads move, then all of it's accelerating. Linear acceleration means accelerating in a straight line. And this is where we think of balance being kind of part of this, because one form of linear acceleration that we are subjected to at all times is gravity, right? It's a straight down kind of linear acceleration. And these organs detect that. And whenever our posture deviates away from that gravitational vector, like if I'm leaning one way or another, then that deviation in linear acceleration is detected by the vestibular organs, and that tells us something about our posture and whether we are falling. But there are also, as part of the vestibular organs, these things called semicircular canals, and we have three of them, and they're roughly oriented in three different planes. So that way, when I turn my head in any of these different directions, then that's going to cause rotational acceleration within those canals. There's fluid in these canals that's be swishing around, activating receptors. These receptors inside these organs are actually very similar to the hair cells of the inner ear. And the fact that that's all in the inner ear is likely no coincidence then. We can maybe put this kind of sensory system into the same domain as the touch, proprioception, and kinesthesis, and call it all body sensation or somatosensation, or haptics, again, to use that word. And then last, we have those chemical senses, right? So we have, in terms of taste perception, the primary sensations of sweet, sour, salty, bitter. So this comes from different kinds of chemicals. Sugar molecules like glucose, fructose, maltose, lactose, and so forth have similar enough molecular shapes that they activate certain receptor sites on the taste buds. The way the olfactory receptors work is essentially the same, quite a bit more complicated. We don't easily reduce smell down into a small number of primary smell sensations or odor sensations the way we do for taste. But together, those two things work together to provide a lot of information for flavor perception. Smell is very critical for how we taste the flavor of different kinds of foods. But of course, smell also works at a distance, right? We can detect molecules in the air that are maybe at some distance. But again, that proximal versus distal distinction is relevant here because there could be somebody baking cookies in the kitchen, and that's a distal event, but then the proximal event are little molecules of whatever is emitted by the baking cookies that make it into your nose so that you smell them. That's maybe the most depth we really need to get into for that part of it. If this was a sensation and perception course, we would likely spend quite a bit more time unpacking problem number one, as well as problem number two. We're going to maybe keep this one pretty simple as well. So what happens next is called sensory transduction. Transduction refers to the process of converting energy from one form to another. And that's what's happening here, right? You might think of it as something like AC to DC, right? So if you have a power converter where you can convert between AC and DC, that's kind of what's happening here. But maybe not completely literally. So don't try to run with that metaphor too fast. But we're converting light energy into neural energy. In the case of vision, we are converting those pressure waves, sound pressure waves, into neural energy for hearing. We are converting chemical energy into nerve energy for taste and smell. And we are converting mechanical energy, whether it's direct mechanical contact with the skin or physical accelerations of the head and body, into nerve impulses for haptics and touch. But one thing we also want to talk about here are the nature of the kinds of sensory responses that come from this process here. So when we think about what properties of light are the eyes responding to, we can describe that in physical terms, right? We can talk about what I have listed here as wavelength and photon flux, right? What this refers to when it comes to a light wave is that light waves come in different wavelengths, right? And the visible spectrum ranges from around 400 nanometers to around 700 nanometers. I'm going to remind myself if I have a picture of that. I do not, and that's okay. We don't particularly need to worry about that, but just wanted to see if I stuck a picture in there. And so the wavelength varies continuously between 400 and 700 nanometers, and that's the visible spectrum. And we're going to see that there are differential responses of the different cells in the eye as a function of the wavelengths of light that are coming into the eye. So that's one physical aspect of the light that the eye responds to. The other, photon flux, refers to basically how many photons per second are streaming into the eye. And in a well-lit environment, there's usually a very high number of photons streaming into the eye. But then the next question is, how does that become recognition of an object, right? As the eye detects wavelength and photon flux. Well, what we think here is that what wavelength does is it becomes encoded into the visual system as color, right? And then photon flux becomes encoded into the visual system as brightness levels. And so this is now the beginning of our coded message, right? The brain is receiving a message that this region of the visual field has these colors and these brightness levels, and we're going to go from there, right? Think back to in the first chapter, I showed how a digital camera works. And the digital camera has a lot of individual pixels that get encoded. And what those pixels are doing is they are encoding the local brightness and color values at each pixel location in the image. And that's what gets saved into the JPEG image file, for example, is a bunch of code that specifies the actual value of every single pixel, so that later when I open the file to view the image, what we're doing is we're recreating those same brightness and color values throughout the digital image when I view it on a computer screen. So maybe a similar kind of encoding process is happening here, right? For the ears, on the other hand, the properties of the sound wave that are responded to would be the frequency of the sound wave. So in this case, what's happening is that we see peaks. Frequency is really the inverse of wavelength, so it's a pretty similar idea conceptually, that you have a wave and you're going to have peaks and valleys in the wave, and so the distance between the peaks is the actual wavelength, right? You can measure the distance between the peaks. So for light, that's like I said, about 400 nanometers, so very, very short wavelengths here. For pressure waves, those are longer wavelengths, but we tend to prefer using the word frequency, which is if I was able to see those peaks moving through the air, I could count how many peaks per second pass some fixed point in the environment. And that would be frequency. So for this, we're talking about numbers like maybe 1,000 hertz, right? So 1,000 hertz means that 1,000 peaks per second would be flowing past a certain point. That's certainly a sound that's within the range of human hearing. In fact, we can hear technically as low as around 20 hertz. And we can hear as high as 20,000 hertz, though we don't normally hear so well at those higher frequencies. Our most sensitive region for hearing is around 4 to 5,000 hertz, or maybe even a little more broadly, 3 to 6,000. Not quite so critical that we drill that down. And then also amplitude, which is how high are those peaks and valleys in the waveform, and that's going to correspond to loudness, right? So just like with vision, wavelength becomes color and photon flux becomes brightness. Here, frequency becomes pitch, high and low pitch, and amplitude becomes loudness. So again, now the brain is receiving this encoded message that there is a sound happening that has certain pitches and loudnesses, and can we make sense of that somehow? Same goes for pressure, right? So these mechanical receptors in the skin are going to respond to pressure. And so physical pressure can be converted into some sort of sensation of felt pressure. Scale, what I'm referring to here is that if I'm holding something in my hand, I can tell when it's small or large based on how much skin surface is maybe impacted here. So I know that it's a small object versus a large object based on how much my skin contact was required to get my hand around it, right? I mentioned vibrations earlier, so the idea is that different frequencies of vibration will result in different responses in these mechanical receptors. Not to mention the strength of the vibration. We can detect very subtle, gentle vibrations versus more heavy, jerky kind of getting moved around like in a bumpy ride on a car. And also pain and temperature are different kind of specialized processes here. We have special nociceptive systems, pain processing systems, for example. And then, of course, I've already covered the chemosensation, right? The different chemicals map into these different kinds of sensory receptors. So again, the presence of certain molecules equals an encoded information about certain levels of sweetness in the food that you're eating, or certain levels of sourness or saltiness and so forth. But of course, our next major challenge is to address this question. Now that we have this array of sensations, right? Brightness and loudness, pitch and color and all of this sort of stuff. that's not all, that's not the whole story, right? Because as I'm noting right here, this is our challenge number 3. How do these visual sensations inform the brain about what the object is? Because importantly, when we are perceiving, we are not necessarily perceiving the sensations per se, right? Just like we're not perceiving the light rays per se, right? We're perceiving via the light rays. We are also kind of perceiving via the sensations. So in this case, what's happening is that when I bite into an apple, I am generally aware of what? I am aware that I'm eating an apple, right? I'm not necessarily thinking, sweet, crunchy. I mean, maybe I notice these things. But perhaps more relevant is that if I'm just looking out the window and noticing a squirrel in the tree, and I'm watching that, again, I'm just really just aware of the squirrel in the tree. I'm not necessarily thinking about the brightness levels of individual little sections of my visual field and the different colors. Certainly, I'm aware when the leaves are green and so forth, right? But we're not necessarily focusing on all of that low level stuff, right? We're really just working at a much higher level of perceptual awareness here. So that means that this process of going from sensation to perception is where we have encoded the proximal stimulus information about the light and the sound waves and all that stuff. And we're going to have to send that to the brain, and there's going to have to be a decoding that happens. But how does that decoding work? Well, when I used the analogy earlier of there being, if I encoded an actual written message, the only way that you could decode that, there's a couple ways that you could decode it, right? One is I could give you a key, right? And this key would tell you what rules that I was following that would allow you to decrypt or decode my encoded message. So if we have something like that, then the brain can decode this. But it's not clear exactly that the brain would have access to that information. So another possibility is maybe some form of guesswork, right? And so what's happening here, let's go back to the issue of decoding a message, right? So let's say that I could make a couple of guesses as to what I think this message is supposed to be. Now, in one case, I could be really, really wrong, right? But if I am going to start maybe doing things, if I'm going to start making judgments, making decisions to do things in response to what I think this coded message is telling me, then if I'm really wrong about my interpretation or my guess, this is going to cause problems, right? I'm going to make some kind of terrible mistake. Like if I'm an actual spy and I misinterpret or misinfer this encoded message, I'll probably get myself captured or whatever, right? But on the other hand, if I am really good, right? So how do I get better? Well, maybe what happens is I get feedback, right? So I make an incorrect guess, but then I start doing things and making decisions and I encounter errors. But I learn from those errors, and those errors then help me refine my judgments and my inferences, so that the next round of judgments are better, and then better and better and better, and eventually I'm actually pretty good now. So I've kind of just figured out over time through what we might call perceptual learning. Now you might think, oh, is this what babies do? And the answer could be, yeah, right. That could exactly be what babies are doing. That William James described the perceptual reality of infants as a blooming, buzzing confusion. And whether that's true or not, that's one way to think about it. And then the idea is that over time, perhaps what's happening is that through some form of inferential guesswork combined with feedback, they get better and better and better. And then this blooming, buzzing confusion starts to reduce and can cohere into organized and meaningful patterns and groupings and objects and things. And then everything starts to make sense and start to work a little bit better. It's also worth potentially pointing out that this is not too far different from what happens with AI, right? So if you hear about training AI, what are we doing there? Well, what we're doing is we're giving it a lot of data, and it has to make some judgments about what this data means, but we also give the AI feedback. We tell it when it's right and when it's wrong, and then it kind of iteratively goes through all of that training data until it starts to identify the patterns that are consistent, and it now is able to start recognizing things, right? So that could be what's happening, right? Something like that. We're going to talk a little bit more detail about these kinds of inferential issues deeper into these notes here. Now, I think what we want to do is maybe wrap it up here. So let's cover this slide a little bit. But what I've just described, this idea that the brain is receiving an encoded message, but it doesn't know the meaning of this encoded message, and it requires some work on the part of the brain to interpret it and decode it. This is better stated right here as what's called the poverty of stimulus argument. And this is maybe another kind of problem in perception as well, because I have this question here: how does perception overcome this, right? So what we're saying here is that perception itself is very rich. And what do I mean by that? I mean that when we perceive the world, we see lots of detail in great clarity, assuming your eyes are working okay or you got your glasses on like I do. You can see all of these colors and objects and things, and you can have this very, very rich perceptual experience, visually, auditorily, haptically, taste and smell, all this kind of stuff, right? But what I've just described is a process that is very impoverished. That is, the objects of perception, the trees and the squirrels and the apples and all of that stuff are reduced down to individual light rays and pressure on the skin and chemicals on the taste buds, which then get encoded as sensations of brightness and color and loudness and pitch and sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and so on and so forth. So that signal going to the brain is pretty strongly impoverished in comparison to the richness of the outside world. And yet, nevertheless, once we get to the level of perception, my perceptual reality is in fact very, very rich. And that richness does in fact correspond to the detail of the outside world. So that's the main question that we are dealing with here. Perception, the world is rich with information. Perception is rich with our awareness of all of that. But in between the two is an impoverished signal connecting the dots here a little bit. And so that's what we mean by calling this the poverty of stimulus argument, is that the stimulus itself doesn't seem to carry very much information, and yet we're still capable of perceiving a rich world around us. How does that work? The argument here, this is relevant to that inferential question that I was kind of getting at here, is that one of the main jobs of perception is to add meaning to what is otherwise seen as kind of meaningless input here. So I have this quote at the top of the slide. You might find this somewhere in our textbook even. Electromagnetic energy contains no psychological meaning. And so what does that mean? What this means is that a single light ray entering into your eye that has a particular photon flux in a particular wavelength, and that's the electromagnetic energy, does not carry any meaning in terms of what is the object that is reflected from. Could it have been an apple? Maybe. Could it have been a person wearing a red t-shirt? Again, maybe. Could have the same brightness, could have the same color, right? So that one individual light ray has no meaning. It's just electromagnetic energy. And likewise, of course, when we talk about the individual rods and cones in the retina that are activated in response to that and encoding information about brightness and color, that single cell response also contains no psychological meaning. And then the convergence onto other neurons, do those contain psychological meaning? Well, it's hard to say. At what point do we go from individual cellular activation to now having psychological meaning? Where does that happen? How does that happen in the brain? Well, that's a hard question. And that, of course, is an important question. And it is one of the major questions when it comes to understanding how perception works in the first place, is that we are engaging in some kind of additive process here, a constructive process, right? We are constructing a perceptual reality out of impoverished beginnings. But somehow that perceptual reality that we construct has a lot of richness that we think aligns to the outside world, although I suppose it's also possible to imagine that it could be largely false, right? That maybe the rich perceptual experience we are having does not correspond to reality. It certainly doesn't match the physicist's depiction of reality that I mentioned at the beginning here. Last example is at the bottom, is that when we perceive a visual world, we perceive a three-dimensional world. We see objects as having a width and a height and a depth, right? But the visual input is actually flat. The image projected to the back of the eye, to the retina by the lens, is a literal projection from 3D into 2D. And so then the image that the rods and cones are extracting data from is a two-dimensional image, but somehow we're able to still perceive a three-dimensional world despite that. So again, it suggests that the missing third dimension is somehow added back in later. So again, more meaning gets added in later. Now, I don't want to get into the details. This video has gone on long enough, but I'm going to get to this slide and stop it right here. Because this slide it depicts a visual depiction or schematic of this perceptual process. But I'm going to stop it now, and we will pick up with this slide when we get back to the next part. So until then, that's it.